It's a great pleasure to welcome Roger Miket, Sarah Semple to talk about new discoveries at Yeavering, Northumberland. Sarah is Professor in Archaeology at Durham University. Her research and publications focus on the landscape and material culture of early medieval Britain and Northern Europe. She began fieldwork at Yeavering in 2010 with the Yeavering Trust, initially trialling out different kinds of survey techniques on the site of the early medieval palace. And from 2021, with Roger Miket and other colleagues from Durham and East Washington University, she has initiated a new phase of excavation at this well-known multi-period site previously excavated by Brian Hope Taylor. Roger Miket has been an esteemed member of this society since 1969, spending many of those years researching and publishing the archaeology of the region.
I'd like to begin, first of all, really by acknowledging a debt to Ian Ralston for much fruitful discussion about Hope Taylor. Of course, he knew him well. And for a long time, we've been talking about Hope Taylor, and he's just sort of changed. He's moved in our thinking quite a bit, as you perhaps hear. And secondly, of course, if anything I say this evening, you can understand, it's entirely because of Adam Welfare's gentle guiding hand in desludging the text of what I'm about to say to you. So, in 1969, John Purvis. Oh, I thought my mic's on.
Sorry, we don't have anything in here for the room. Microphone is for the Zoom. Sorry.
Should I? Well, I shall speak up. That's the answer. I'll turn my volume up. In 1969, John Purvis, the owner of Yeavering Farm, made an application to Northumberland County Council to recommence the extraction of sand and gravel from the fields at Yeavering in which the Royal Palace buildings lay. As the field had been scheduled in 1953, the council looked to the Ancient Monuments Board for guidance. Having managed to extricate themselves just a few years before from the excavation of the site, they had no wish to become again entangled in further archaeological work there, notwithstanding the considerable swathes that remained unexamined. Actively discouraging a public campaign to save it, led by Rupert Bruce Mitford, the decision of the board when it appeared was uncompromisingly stark. In view of the excavations carried out at this important site and subject to watching briefs, we agreed to the proposed resumption of gravel working and to the site being eventually removed from the schedule. They were quite content to let it disappear. Fortunately, John Purvis found no buyer for his field, so this important early medieval site remained intact for future examination. As we shall hear from Sarah, following much preparatory research and consultation, a new phase of excavation began at Yeavering in 2021. Building a consensus of support for reinvestigation of the site, certainly one as well documented and notable as Yeavering, was challenging, and it's greatly to Sarah's credit that she managed to accomplish this. As you will learn from her, the results exceeded all expectations. Now, many of the arguments for returning to Yeavering are common to other sites. It would, however, be falling short to argue for a new phase of inquiry based solely upon the need to add to our understanding of the site as a result of new research undertaken elsewhere, or simply in the light of advances in scientific techniques today used in archaeology, made in the decades since Hope Taylor excavated. In his Yeavering report, Hope Taylor is present to an unusual extent, as throughout its text, he attempts to influence the reader's perspective by pressing an argument here or encouraging a particular viewpoint there. It's clear that some understanding of him is advisable in evaluating the robustness of his reading of the site's history, and certainly prudent when formulating strategies for its reinvestigation. I'm going to press this button and see if the slide changes. There we go. Look at that. It was probably sometime in 1950 that Brian Hope Taylor saw Kenneth St. Joseph's aerial photographs of the site. These showed crop marks of rectangular structures, and Hope Taylor was convinced that it showed the long-lost palace and royal township of King Edwin of Northumbria, mentioned by Bede. And he determined to prove this through excavation. In June 1952, commercial extraction of sand and gravel at the western end of the plateau on which the settlement sat threatened its archaeology. And with the participation of Sir Walter Aitchison of Copeland Castle and Sir Ian Richmond, Hope Taylor mounted a very effective and well-orchestrated campaign that ultimately left the Ministry of Works with no option other than to finance the excavation of the site. Beginning in 1953, he spent the following 4 years excavating here, usually in the spring and autumn months, when the sand and gravels might best show up the archaeological features. He teased out evidence for an extensive prehistoric activity across the whole of the Neolithic period and a large and long-lived Bronze Age cemetery. But most striking and central to his purpose, he disclosed a succession of early medieval buildings which comprised royal halls, service buildings, a pagan temple, a Christian church, a grandstand on the Roman model for large public events, and a massive enclosure. His abilities as an excavator, in combination with his skills as an artist, allowed him to produce an influential and well-regarded report. And when it finally appeared, 20 years after the completion of the excavation, it received excellent reviews. Philip Rath's, for example. In the 27 years since the excavations of Yeavering began, the site has become something of a legend. The excavation was the finest ever done in this country. The recording and allied analysis was of the highest order. The drawings must find a major place in any survey of archaeological draftsmanship. Finally, the text, including the lengthy captions to the illustrations, is elegant, readable, and witty, rare qualities in modern reports. Who wouldn't glow at getting something like this said about what you've written? In the decades that followed, apart from some minor criticism, his text has withstood the test of time better than many of its day. And following his death in 2001, an exhibition at a conference were held to honor his achievement. The papers given on that occasion later appeared in a book, Yeavering, People, Power and Place, edited by Paul Frodsham and Colm O'Brien, who's with us here this evening. And this publication coincided also with the founding of the Yeavering Trust, which today manages part of the site. In many ways, this marked the apogee of Hope Taylor's Yeavering. Thereafter, criticism became less muted as significant flaws were revealed. Tim Gates suggested his prehistoric field systems may rather have been periglacial fossil wedges, as indeed excavation in 2023 seemed to confirm. In addition, Colm, again with forensic scrutiny, showed the fragility of his claims for the dating of the Great Enclosure. And it was not just the comments, but the silences on matters once relevant, but now overtaken by work on other sites that now denoted the quiet, almost imperceptible aging of its text, notwithstanding its brilliance and the pioneering methods of excavation upon which it is based. Hope Taylor's Ad Yeavering has become as much a victim to the flaws inherent in its dependency upon a mid-1950s reading of historical texts as it was in its dependency upon outdated models of Neolithic and Bronze Age society. It is a reading of its day, and that alone might qualify it for a critique. But there's more. And in the time available, though, I can pick out for consideration just two of these for closer examination, each of which points up a larger trait in his work. The first concerns the site's chronology. Establishing the date of the medieval horizon is of vital importance, but the site only produced two datable objects. It produced a coin from building A3, and it produced a buckle that wasn't dated until 20 years after the excavation and following the publication of the excavation report. Although in its infant years, radiocarbon dating was available to Hope Taylor, and indeed the ministry pressed him to submit samples for dating, believing he had better understanding of the site's chronology than radiocarbon could offer, he refused. And so he worked on for 4 years in the mistaken belief that he was excavating the palace site of the 16-year-long reign of a single king, Edwin of Northumbria. Only in his final months did he realize he was confronted with a far more extensive timescale for the early medieval buildings. Just one single date obtained from the Great Enclosure would have resulted in a markedly different final excavation report. And had a charcoal been submitted for Doon Hill, a site in East Lothian he claimed to be of early medieval date, but which we now know to be early Neolithic, this would have prevented him from making perhaps the most egregious mistake in medieval studies. Such missteps in judgment invite questions as to the personality of the excavator, especially as it might affect other interpretations elsewhere on the site. Now, this criticism is not made lightly or with the intent of diminishing his considerable achievements. But if an interpretation is wrong, as Colm said, we need to know, and if possible, understand why. Hope Taylor's scholarly text is of great complexity in which much is entwined. He didn't like gaps in his story, and he labored hard at Yeavering to create a seamless transition from the Neolithic to the Anglo-Saxon period, one in which everything was presented and explained in such detail as to be unassailable. Professor Graham Campbell was the first to remark how this perfectionism may have been driven by a lack of confidence in not having an undergraduate qualification. He went straight to his doctorate and straight to it. He had no undergraduate training. This had other impacts as well, not least being he wasn't trained in enumeration of features and things like this, which introduced other issues into the reports he's left behind him. This sounds as though I don't like him. I've got great respect for the man and for so much of what he did. But the thing is, we need to know where it's not right. And if his personality helps explain some of these, then we can get a better handle on understanding these for the future. Graham Campbell was the first to remark how this perfectionism may have been driven by a lack of confidence in not having an undergraduate qualification. It's an observation also underlined by the TV producer Forbes Taylor, who worked closely with Hope Taylor on a number of TV series, who recognized what today we would label perhaps imposter syndrome. And it's surely this that drove him to overcompensate in the delivery of what he believed was expected of him, not least in a preternatural urge to provide an explanation for all that he was finding. Again, time limits presentation of the details, but his chronology for the whole site rests upon the gathering of all the evidence for the destruction of buildings at the site through burning. He then divides them into two episodes of conflagration he associates with two historically recorded attacks within the kingdom. It is neat, it is beguiling, it ties the archaeology of the site into a wider history of the kingdom and calendrical time, but it is a chimera and is totally without foundation. And in rejecting this interpretation, the whole of the evidential basis for his chronological sequence for the site dissolves. This is not to say that his final chronology was necessarily wrong, only that the basis upon which it was advanced was incorrect. The second element requiring closer examination are his site plans. For the most part, they appear to be accurate representations of what he found. However, there are occasions where it is unclear what these are truly showing, and a hint that all is not necessarily as he would have it. A case in point is the situation at the entrance to his great enclosure. See his great enclosure on the right, you can see the terminals on the left with the two circles there. This shows on St. Joseph's aerial photographs as a wide passageway flanked by rounded torque-like terminals. The eastern terminal was badly damaged by a landslip in 1951, and his excavation could make nothing of its interior. The western terminal was similarly degraded, but here he felt able to identify the slight remnants of features clearly shown in his earliest plan, that's the one on the left, as a square structure that largely filled the diameter of the terminal. It's shown again in his tracing on the right-hand side as you're looking at it. In subsequent plans, though, this square tower-like structure has been extended eastwards, altering its shape. You can see where it's now in the left-hand side, it's extended into a building type, it's now extended eastwards, altering its shape to now approximate to the ground plans of a building he'd found elsewhere on the site, and one of a type to which he could assign a date. In order to accommodate this, the terminal diameter has been doubled in size. These emendations would reach their final expression in the model and illustration he prepared, perhaps for public lecture, which showed how he imagined the entrance terminals and their buildings may have appeared. Now, the generous-spirited, inclined to give the benefit of doubt, might accept this as simply the correction of data gathered under pressure, for at this time Hope Taylor was struggling to recover all he could from the site before the ministry's deadline for the completion of the excavation approached. But for two reasons, this cannot be a simple mistake. Firstly, for reasons which Sarah will reveal, in the early medieval period, no great enclosure stood here, and there were no rounded terminals for any buildings to stand within. Had any such building ever stood here, they would have stood upon what was open ground. Nor is this the only example we have of Hope Taylor proposing the existence of something structural for which the evidence is absent. Between 1964 and 1966, Hope Taylor excavated two buildings at Doon Hill. The site in East Lothian that I mentioned earlier, these lay within a partially polygonal enclosure. The earlier, he believed, had been a British hall, and the later, superimposed with great precision over it, he believed to have been of Anglian construction. His arguments for the date of the latter was based upon its ground plan, its proportions, and its method of construction. But what would cement it as a building of the first millennium CE was the unpublished plan prepared after the 1966 excavations that here included the possibility of an annex at its western end. This possibility would harden on his drawing, on the right-hand side as you're looking, into a ground plan that was the mirror image of Edwin's successor, Oswald's Hall at Yeavering. Yet this feature is not only absent from his earlier site plans, but it's not visible on any of his photographs or previously referred to elsewhere. Ian Ralston, who both excavated with Hope Taylor at the site as a boy, and whose knowledge of the Doon Hill archive is unequaled, is rightly sceptical of the existence of a feature which is characteristic of early medieval architecture, but attached to a building we now know to be Neolithic. All the finds and radiocarbon dates indicate this. Show it, prove it. How then might we read some of the other Yeavering plans and illustrations that are on an evolving trajectory to what he presents so firmly delineated in his final 1977 report? As Ian has shown, Hope Taylor set great store by his plans and illustrations as a useful medium for conveying his ideas and his hypotheses. He remarks upon images which are the site and its features as wished for or hypothesized in advance. For Hope Taylor, a graphic artist, illustration was as much a conversation on interpretation as it was a visual depiction of the reality. And these plans and drawings show something else. They show the gradual formulation within his mind of an archaeological template based upon his work at Yeavering, one that might perhaps have wider geographical resonance. This included not only the plans of buildings, but other elements, such as a clear sequence of constructional techniques beginning here at Yeavering with Space Coast construction, which he believed might be owed to British influence. Moreover, this included the evolution of architectural responses for dealing with load-bearing structures and signature changes in the mixed Brittonic Anglo-Saxon hybrid society, which he believed was sustained by his findings in the 4 cemeteries at the site. Hope Taylor was undoubtedly a brilliant excavator and a gifted writer, and his work, when it appeared, marked a watershed in early medieval archaeology. But he was also evasive, insecure, secretive, and as Hope Taylor's and others have shown, at times over-imaginative. These are personality traits that need to be remembered when evaluating his reading of the site, and may be thought sufficient on their own account to justify the new work at Yeavering, which you shall hear about now. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger, for such a wonderful sort of scene setting for the emerging results from a new collaboration. And I just wanted to say right at the start, for my part of this, one of the common questions that I have when we speak about the new project is, you have got scheduled monument consent, haven't you? So this is really just to say right up front that this is quite a project, quite a long time in the making. We had workshops and stakeholder involvement. And obviously we had to create a project design and discuss that with Historic England as well as the landowners. And our project is hinged on a number of sort of key facets. First, that we did have the potential now, if we re-excavate at Yeavering, to think about secure dating and phasing on the site using scientific methods, something that Hope Taylor had not chosen to test out in his excavations. We also, of course, have the potential to look at environmental evidence in different ways to those perhaps available to Hope Taylor at the time. And there's also the possibility to unite new excavations with work on the archival material and return to Hope Taylor's finds, which the Yeavering Trust had been curating, and to think about that opportunity for scientific dating. This slide is also here just to remind me right up front to say, well, it's me speaking here and Roger. This is a team effort, so it involves many collaborators and specialists as part of the project. And I'm really delighted that I'm going to be able to give you some of those first initial results from our 2021 and 2023 seasons. I'm just going to say right up front here that we're looking to the north of the road at Yeavering. So we're looking at an aerial photographic image where you can pick out the great enclosure, and overlaying that is the string of buildings, the C buildings that sort of strike out over to the north on the site, right over to the edge of the big gravel plateau. And this shows you the 2 areas of excavation that we've concentrated on. So in 2021, we were up just over here at the far edge of the plateau, looking at a building called C1, which Hope Taylor had excavated and was what we might term a sunken feature building or craftworking structure. Although we were also very interested in a crop mark just to the north of that, which had been untested previously. And in 2023, we were located here, just overlapping with and adjacent to the palace complex in area A and B, and overlapping over that great enclosure, over the outer ditch of the great enclosure. And that was one of our primary foci that season for re-excavation. I'm going to, perhaps controversially, jump on to 2023 first and come back to 2021. So what you're looking at here is some of our geophysical prospection on the site. I'm not going to talk a huge amount about that today, but I can come back to it in the questions. But we've covered hectares with magnetometry, cart-based magnetometry, providing lots of new and interesting results. One of the areas that really stuck out from that survey work was just over here. So just to orientate you, if you look at the red dot on the screen, you'll see that outer ditch of the great enclosure showing up really clearly. You'll probably not be able to pick out much of the traces of the palace. They don't show up so well, the excavated area of the larger tall buildings. You might see these, what we thought were sort of interesting subcircular features, perhaps glacial features or ditches here. So we were quite interested in coming in 2023, exposing these anomalies on the geophysics, but also using that trench to open up and resample the trench opened by Hope Taylor through the outer ditch of the great enclosure. And you can see that photograph there of his original excavated trench. We're also keen in that process to open up a new area within that outer ditch of the great enclosure and to give us an opportunity to relook at Hope Taylor's stratigraphy, to sample for scientific dating, but also open a new section so we could actually get environmental evidence and deposits from that ditch section. So I hope you can see more clearly here. Here's our trench as we opened it up, aiming to overlap and expose this area. Hopefully you can see that, it's always great when things go well. So we had to GPS this trench in the Great North Field. And when we machined that area open, we went straight down onto where we could see that lovely shadow, that darker soil at the outer ditch of the great enclosure. And what was even more exciting with Roger's keen eyes, he sort of picked out straight away that we had the edges of Hope Taylor's trench through that outer ditch of the great enclosure. You can see that coming up in a really lovely way on those first drone shots of the site. What we could see straight away, however, was a level of complexity that wasn't on Hope Taylor's plans. So what you're looking at here is complicated, but here is the outer ditch as he drew it in plan. You can see there are a number of palisade or fence slots that he marked out, one here, another pair here with a gap. And these he numbered up as FP1, FP2, and FP3. But straight away in plan with those drone shots, we could see additional stone-packed, charcoal-rich palisade slots that are very similar running through the fills of that outer ditch of the great enclosure. So straight away, there are all sorts of questions that began to spring to mind. So our main aim really on this side of the site was to uncover and expose the ditch sequence. And that's what we're looking at here. Now, there are two sections that we cut through the ditch. So two things I could talk about, but I'm going to simplify it today just in terms of time. This is the south-facing section. Sorry, south-facing section of the north ditch, or the north, the north trench that we opened on the ditch. But above that, you can see Hope Taylor's drawn section through the outer ditch of the great enclosure. And hopefully, as sharp-eyed archaeologists, you'll be able to pick out differences straight away in this sequence. Namely, Hope Taylor particularly thought, and in his interpretation, that there were large timber uprights within that ditch slot that had been embedded and buried, creating the foundations for a freestanding palisade, and that they had been pulled out. You can also see that he thought there were relationships with what he called particularly some anomalous features, or some features he thought that might be earlier, particularly one that shows in a section over here. So he was aware there might be a deeper time sequence to the great enclosure from the outer ditch. But he was also thinking about it particularly as sort of a double circuit of major sort of timber palisades. And of course, in his reconstructions, he thought of some of those having sort of walkways and sort of almost sort of fortified and militarized aspects to them. Our sections, and I'm just giving you one here, tell quite a different story. First and foremost, straight away, we've got two phases to the ditch. One large cut here and a secondary cut sometime in its lifetime. we absolutely do have that relationship Hope Taylor talked about with some earlier feature that's more indistinct, that first ditch cuts through. Whether that was a preceding ditch, we don't know, but it's certainly perhaps, it's certainly an earlier feature, and we'll come back to that later on. And there we can also see these really nice stone-packed, charcoal-rich sort of palisade slots in the very upper fills cutting through that ditch sequence. The other things to point out here for you, if you look at the fills of that first opening, the lovely laminations there of slippage of the gravels and sand into that sort of first feature, sealing within them lovely thick packed charcoal layers. Fantastic. We're hugely excited by that discovery. It's then recut, and in the sequence of sort of refilling that we can see in that second feature, and this is now being corroborated by Karen Millett with sort of really close-grained geomorphological work and looking at thin sections taken through resin blocks taken from this. We've got a very different way that this ditch is filled up in its second phase. These are big slumps of material that have almost been pushed in a homogenized way, sort of filling that second cut back up. So really interesting. Potentially something that fills quite quickly here is recut, and then partial demolition of something to the right, with which materials pushed back in. So with all of Roger's warnings about, maybe overinterpretation and thinking, not giving too much away, some things immediately sort of sprang to mind as whether this might actually be the two ditches to the right, FP2 and FP1 and FP2, that we had seen, which Hope Taylor recorded, may actually be the sort of timber revetments of an earthen bank. And in fact, what we're looking at in the lifetime of this feature is the collapse or intentional demolition of a large upstanding monument or embankment, and that being pushed in to that ditch, and it's filling up right the way up until we get those later cuts and charcoal-rich cuts and fences. So really exciting. So FP2 and FP3, he thought perhaps of palisades, potentially holding a bank material. And we can see from that lovely reconstruction, not of our sites, but coming from, of course, prehistoric Load and Iron Age sites, that we might be envisaging something like this as the construction of the outer ditch of the great enclosure at Yeavering. Other things that sprang up that were super exciting, we had distributions of burnt material we thought actually initially was the residue from metalworking or bloom, and only when we got it back to the university and had a look at it did we realise it's something called Iron Age grey. Not so familiar to me, but very familiar to anyone working on Iron Age palisade enclosures, where apparently it's a very common where you've got a burnt structure. So on that slide, all the distribution there, the lovely sort of yellow triangles, were all of this burnt material in these upper layers of the outer ditch sequence. And you can see here just how close we are to the palace complex, right there next to sort of the fences enclosing A3, A4, and I guess there's always been a question in my mind when I saw reconstructions of Yeavering, why you have those big palace buildings and halls backing onto something sort of immediately like the great enclosure. Well, perhaps we're beginning with our results to show that that relationship is quite different. So an even bigger surprise awaited us. I think Roger's absolutely right when he says Hope Taylor was an incredible excavator. This is one of the hardest archaeologies and geologies that I've ever dealt with. I'm very, very lucky to have a team and to be guided, by expertise, particularly and familiarity with the gravels and sands, because you get differential drying. So things pop out, disappear, pop out again. Absolutely extraordinary. So there we were, very excited, beginning to open our trenches and think about the sequence of the enclosure ditch. And again, Roger's keen eyes spotted a string of post holes, not as Hope Taylor had recorded them in relation to Palisade 5, coming across and stopping or being cut by the great enclosure, the outer ditch of the great enclosure, which is of course key to the relationship between the successive hall structures, but actually marching straight the way across, like sort of footsteps, right the way across the upper fill of that outer ditch. So we have to think about that. Not only the 2 phases, possibly even 3 for that outer ditch, but it's completely filled up by the point that we have that fence line, that staggered post holes marching across it. And they relate directly to the Hall complex, or to one phase of the Hall complex. So, you know, this was incredibly interesting, and immediately sort of told us that we had some substantial time difference between the outer ditch of the great enclosure and the halls that we would traditionally perhaps associate with Edwin and the kings that Hope Taylor had aligned the site with within his sequence. So dating, really fantastic. Our initial dating for this, which came through just at Easter, has really supported that. And I know some of you might be aware already, but we have got late Bronze Age through to Iron Age dates for that sequence. And that gives us both phases. So you can see the earliest dates, interestingly there, which are about 1000 to 900 BC, are from that very early feature that we don't know is a previous ditch or not, but it's there and it's truncated. We then have something around 400 to 350 to 205 for that fill, those rapid fills of that first filling up of the ditch. And then again later on, you know, we're looking really at sort of mid to late Iron Age dates for the development of this complex. So immensely exciting, and places the outer ditch, I guess, you know, by inference, possibly the whole great enclosure, into something that's much more akin to sites that have been mentioned before, which are lowland Iron Age enclosures, which are familiar within the Borders and Northumberland. Perhaps what's really exciting, this is just for the prehistorians among you, and I'll move swiftly on, is that it's, you know, it gives us a different picture perhaps of that prehistoric landscape prior to the time period I'm so excited by and interested in. So here on our geophysics, we have something that's known from aerial photographs, which is the Burroughses, which is a big trivalite enclosure overlooking sort of the lowland plain and the River Glen below. This is now our prehistoric great enclosure. Can't really see that on the geophysics, so that's the location. This enclosure thought, you know, undated because it's on crop marks and comes up in the geophysics, a broken ditch, sort of partially circular enclosure here to the south. And the geophysics and my colleague Brian over here on this sort of tiny knoll, another double ditch apparently on the edge of that knoll, potentially again some kind of prehistoric enclosure. And of course, we've got the hill fort as well. So our results, once you start to put them into the context of other potential prehistoric features on the site, begin to make the Iron Age look really quite exciting, and perhaps much more interesting than previously thought, given we have very limited understanding of that Iron Age gap, if you like, between the hill fort and the early medieval material until this point. So just thinking here about very quickly other implications, it also begins to decouple the great enclosure from the early medieval site and the palace complex, because we can begin to see those hall complexes as being somewhat significantly later. And I'll say something just very briefly here, which is we've always thought about perhaps the east-west arrangements of structures on the site. Well, actually, we may have some implication there of doorways looking north, and perhaps we need to rethink the architecture and layout of that early medieval site, particularly now we don't have that large enclosure sort of backing onto the palace complex. Something else to think about. Roger talked about the way Hope Taylor dated the site and the successive phases of burning that came from the charcoal fills. But one thing that's really interesting is the burials, or the string burials, over on the eastern side, over by the large barrow post, the great enclosure and the hall complex. One of the reasons that he places them as he does is because of charcoal-rich fills of those graves. He sees them potentially as a result of a crisis of burning in relation to the chronology of the site. Well, now we have lots of prehistoric burnt material over on that side of the site. There are things we need to kind of go back and reconsider there, because that could all be residual material rather than material related to these very sort of tight phases of early medieval activity that he placed, in particular in relation to things like the raiding by Penda within the region. Okay, so moving now to back in time to 2021, so our first testing of the site. We are right over on the north of the plateau, and there you can see an aerial shot looking to the west, looking over the two trenches that we opened. The first, hopefully, to relocate building C1, the sunken feature structure, get some dating material, and then to take a look at our new feature. So here we are. I'm going to be very brief about this because I think Roger can come in on the questions. He's done some excellent work on looking at differences in the architecture of this structure from Hope Taylor's interpretation. But the super fantastic thing was to open that up and find the timbers, the burnt timbers intact, just as Hope Taylor had photographed and recorded them, where they had sort of collapsed or were sort of preserved within the base of that sunken feature structure or craftworking building. This was a structure associated with loom weights, potentially with textile production, just as we see it in other parts of the country in the early medieval period. Think about the 6th and the 7th centuries. There's more complexity to that and its architectural form, but I won't say too much on that now. I'll move straight on to our second trench. So we were delighted when we opened this up to discover we had another structure. We had the shadow of another structure, again, a sunken feature building. We were able to excavate that and find some fantastic preserved material. So this is a structure that is cut really deeply, as you can see in those images, really deeply into the slope of that plateau. So taking advantage of the kind of sloping off of the plateau, perhaps for shelter. It evens out, there is definitely sort of plough erosion there, but it seems to sort of even out with a nice sort of first floor levels, particularly showing perhaps sort of heat damage or fire or burning. We've got red levels related to those first floor levels. And that structure is presumably roofed or covered, but it has success its phase. It's quite complicated. It goes in and out of use. It has repairs, and it is extended during one period of use with smaller posts to kind of extend that revetment out. So incredibly interesting. The architectural qualities of this structure, of course, it is a sunken structure, but it's not quite a sunken feature building. It's quite analogous in how it's built with post-built supports, but having a sunken floor to D3. So there are affinities with other elements of architecture on the site. But it is, by the looks of it, open on one side. So taking advantage of that slope, perhaps as a craftworking structure for air, for circulation, for sort of the dirty industrial activities that might take place. Very briefly, we had lovely preservation. So we had working surfaces where we could excavate and see material distributed across them. And then we had phases of apparently sterile material. So it looks like we have some periods of use and disuse with material coming in. And later on, again, I won't say too much about this, but like D3, later on we had a big later infilling of clay or material, almost like an intentional dump. So really going out of use and changing use in its lifetime. Animal bone assemblages, cattle, that's lovely. Lots of broken rib fragments. They look like they're for extracting grease or fat. But going with, what we know, the faunal assemblages from Hope Taylor's excavations, so sticking with cattle. We had some fantastic small finds, so glass beads, some multicolored beads, and also quartz coming from bead festoons. So classic early medieval sort of female attire, little broken fragments of them that come up through the residues and sieving as well, perhaps giving us some hints of who was working in these structures at these different intervals. We've got loom weights, both baked and unbaked, and potentially sort of handfuls of clay with sort of almost like it looked like being in the palm of somebody's hand. So it looks like we've actually got the making of loom weights in this structure. So we might think about sunken feature buildings, being a place for weaving and craft production using baked loom weights, but actually we've got both kinds here. So perhaps this is more about sort of multifunctionality in terms of activity. Oh, and I should say that lovely knife just at the top that was just lying on one of those deposits with bone. So, perhaps giving us that a really nice indication of craft activity and working in that structure. And then environmental evidence, really briefly, again, this is fantastic. Some of the first environmental evidence from the site. all of those rich deposits that were sealed in that structure have given us barley through all levels, so carbonized barley. We potentially got, in one of the sort of later activities, some scrappy sort of corn dryer. We had a sort of real density in that feature of burnt barley. We have wild oats, sorry, cultivated oats, and also wild resources as well. We've got wild oats, hazelnuts, evidence use of some cultivated crops, but also ribwort and brown seaweed, which is really interesting. So potentially coastal resources that are being brought in for different purposes, perhaps on a seasonal basis. And we think about Yeavering, we think about it being quite relatively far from the coast, but accessible perhaps by roads and rivers. But it does tell us something potentially about that idea of regional resource. And this is super brief. This is from another project, the People and Place project, been looking particularly at burials right the way across the Kingdom of Northumbria and looking at that in GIS terms. Well, we know that landscape of the Cheviots is one of the areas of really good cultivatable soil, where we've got those sort of communities in the Millfield Basin perched there in the early medieval period. But look at Yorkshire, where we've got all that lovely sort of rich cultivatable land on that map. You know, this is a very different landscape up in the north in terms of resource and stability for 6th and 7th century communities. And some of our isotopic evidence that's coming from those that project and sort of looking at those burials is giving us some indications for regional mobility and food acquisition for further south in Northumbria. So perhaps telling us that these are precarious landscapes, you know, places where people need to be more mobile in order to survive in those 6th, 7th century periods. So I won't say too much about that, but it gives you a little bit of context for why we might get a site like Yeavering and why people are using it seasonally and why we're getting a mosaic of resources. So onto the biggie, the dating sequence. This is really exciting, and I'm really great. We're both grateful to Andrew Millard for his work with the dates and to the Oxford and Southwark labs. So this is our building CO, so that new craftworking structure. And you can see very quickly, we've got an incredibly tight date range there, excuse me, from around 595, 645 through to 650 to 680. It's had a very high probability, so giving us a 10 to 80 year lifespan for that craftworking structure with its phases of use and disuse. And there's more work to do here. Andrew will be undertaking Bayesian work, you know, to refine those sequences. So we have something incredible, which tells us a very short-lived time period, but a time period that works incredibly well with Hope Taylor's thoughts on chronology, which is interesting, and also Bede's discussions of chronology in relation to the site. So that was enormously exciting. We also, of course, went back to the archive to date what we could, always a risky business. That was things like a sort of twiggy bits of charcoal, any bone where we thought it was viable for dating. And we've got some really amazing results. So you can see the date range here. I've just broken it down because the D complex, the few dates we've been able to get from that are earlier, which corroborates the sequence that we've seen, what Hope Taylor discussed. And you can see really an overall date range between 550 and 670 at very high probability. So incredibly tightly dated again, which is fantastic given the, you know, the poor qualities of the material we were trying to date. And again, we need to do locational work on those to get an even more refined chronology for activity. But you know, putting our building, interestingly, CO, that craftworking structure, towards the late end of the period, and you know, C1, putting that to sort of late end of activity, but putting building A3, big hall complex, potentially around 560 to 655. So really nice. I'll leave you to think about that. This is just, I guess, beginning to sort of point out that, you know, some of the things that are coming through here within that tight date range is quite a lot of phases of use. We've got evidence of seasonal activity in some of those craft structures. So we might, I suppose, looking down the line with these dates, begin to think about this as a much more dynamic site that even Hope Taylor thought by the end of his process, that actually we really are beginning to see sort of seasonal changes and modelling and remodelling within a very short time span. If we think about 80 years, you know, of lifetime of this site, if that's what we're genuinely looking at, that's really interesting for thinking about bigger sort of elite palace complexes and how they operate. So there's much new material. We could definitely got Iron Age activity. We've got a very tight lifespan for the early medieval structures that we've looked at so far. I'm really delighted to have this evidence from multiple types of craftworking, indications of dress and accessories. We've got indication perhaps of brewing and exploitation of wild sources. To me, we're starting to put a story around the elite complex and Bede's narrative around kings and sort of major individuals for the period, beginning to see the more ordinary activities and people that intersected with this site and how they operated in around that larger hall complex. And I just wanted to put that in because this is another whole lecture perhaps, but you know, when we think about the Scandinavian sites, we think about central place complexes, and Rendlesham has been very much in the news recently for new excavations. That's allied to Sutton Hoo, but it's a big multifocal site with areas of craftworking, areas of feasting and activity, and yes, with halls and hall complexes and cemeteries. We've always thought about Yeavering has been a much more tightly defined location and site, but beginning through this work to start to sort of tease the edges out and see activity out on the north and edges of the plateau. We know there's interesting things to the south of the plateau, like Harding's work on metalworking. So there's more to do here, but the more we do, we might begin to think about these kind of seasonal multifocal places that we think about as central places in the North Sea communities for that 6th, 7th through to 10th century period. So I'm going to end there, conscious of time, and I hope I'm spot on, but really to just thank all of the teams so far who've been involved, to point out there's a collaborative effort, but to leave you with, I realise I should be there, to leave you perhaps with the picture of the great hall complex of Yeavering without the great enclosure. You know, that historic England image has been manipulated there. We may need to think about that. I don't want to rule it out completely until we've perhaps gone back and had the chance to look at the inner ditch, but we've certainly changed the chronology and development of that site. I think in terms of current understanding, changed it quite significantly. So thank you very much.